My name is Emily, I'm 34 years old, and if you had asked anyone in my family 10 years ago where I'd be today, none of them would have guessed I'd be here. In fact, if you'd asked my mom, she probably would have said I'd be still figuring things out, while my brothers, David and Matthew, would be running their law firms and tech companies. That's the way it always was in our house. My brothers were the golden boys, and I was the one who never lived up to her potential. I still remember that Christmas night like it happened yesterday. We were sitting in my mother's living room in Boston. The fireplace was lit, the tree was covered in ornaments that had been passed down for generations, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air. It should have felt cozy, but instead, it was suffocating. My mom was sitting in her favorite armchair, glass of wine in hand, watching everyone like a queen overseeing her court. My brothers sat beside her, bragging about their latest promotions and investments. And then there was me, sitting quietly with my cup of chamomile tea, listening. That's when she said it. Emily, you'll never be as successful as your brothers. It's just the way it is. Some people are leaders, and some people, well, they just float. She smirked, taking another sip. I didn't flinch. I just smiled faintly and lifted my tea to my lips. I'd heard words like that from her my entire life. But that night, I wasn't upset, I was waiting. Because I knew what was coming. Out of nowhere, my little niece, Lily, who was only 8 years old, shouted, "And Emily is on the cover of Time magazine." The room went completely silent. David set down his drink. Matthew stopped mid-sentence. My mom's smile froze. All eyes turned to me. And that was the moment I knew, I had finally beaten them all. Growing up, I always felt like the shadow in a house full of spotlights. I was the youngest of 3, and my brothers seemed to have been born with paths already carved out for them. David, the eldest, was destined to be a lawyer. He loved debate, wore suits to school when he was only 13, and my mom adored the way he took charge. Matthew, the middle child, was the tech genius, always building computers, coding, and impressing everyone with his projects. My parents invested in tutors, summer programs, and anything that could help them shine even brighter. Me? I liked to draw. I liked to write. I liked to ask questions and push boundaries in ways that didn't have a neat title or guaranteed paycheck attached to them. My mom used to say, "Emily, your hobbies are cute, but they won't put food on the table." She'd say it with a laugh, but I could hear the disappointment behind every word. By the time I was 18, it was clear who the success stories of the family were. David had already gotten into Harvard. Matthew had started an app that won some kind of national competition. And me? I was working part-time at a bookstore and sketching on the side. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every family reunion, it was the same. My achievements, however small, were brushed aside. But what my family never understood about me was this: I may have been quiet, but I was watching. And every slight, every insult, every time I was told I wasn't good enough, it fueled something in me. A slow burn. A plan. The turning point came when I was 24. I had been working at a small publishing house in New York, barely making rent, when I stumbled across an opportunity. A tech startup was looking for a creative director, someone who could design their branding, tell their story, and make their product stand out. Everyone else saw me as the artsy one who never amounted to much, but I saw a chance. I took the job. That decision changed everything. Because within 2 years, the little startup I joined exploded into something bigger than anyone predicted. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was sitting on something that could not only prove my family wrong but allow me to surpass them completely. And that's when my revenge began to take shape. The startup I joined was called Neurovision, and at the time, nobody believed in it. Just a handful of engineers crammed into a small office in Brooklyn, living off ramen and endless coffee. Their technology was good, revolutionary even, but they didn't know how to tell their story. They needed someone to package their brilliance into something the world could see and understand. That was me. At first, my role felt almost invisible. I was designing logos, building presentations, sketching out ad campaigns that barely had a budget. But slowly, things began to shift. Investors started paying attention, journalists wanted interviews, and customers were curious. For once, the part of me my family mocked, the girl with cute hobbies, was the very thing driving a company forward. I worked like a machine. 12-hour days, weekends, sleepless nights. Every pitch deck, every ad, every campaign had my fingerprints on it. And when NeuroVision landed its first major investor, a Silicon Valley giant, I remember standing in the office kitchen, holding a cheap paper cup of champagne, thinking, they'll see me now. But I didn't just want success. I wanted them to feel what I had felt my whole life, dismissed, underestimated, invisible. Revenge, to me, wasn't about yelling or throwing it in their faces. It was about waiting. Waiting until my name carried more weight than theirs ever could. By the time I was 30, NeuroVision had grown into a billion-dollar company. I was no longer just a creative director, I was chief brand officer. My campaigns were on billboards in Times Square, my speeches were being quoted online, and for the first time, I was being recognized by people who had never once cared about me. I never told my family about any of it. Not a word. When they asked what I was doing, I'd say, oh, still in design, and change the subject. I wanted the reveal to hit them like a storm they never saw coming. And then came the day when Time magazine reached out. They wanted me on the cover for their Most Influential Women in Business issue. I remember sitting in my office, staring at the email, my hands shaking. That was it. That was the moment I had been waiting for my whole life. And I knew exactly when I would make sure my family saw it. Christmas. The weeks leading up to Christmas felt different that year. I wasn't the same girl who used to dread those gatherings, the one who would sit quietly in the corner while my mom bragged about my brother's accomplishments. This time, I had a card in my pocket that no one in that house could compete with. Still, I'll admit, I felt nervous. Not because I doubted myself, I knew exactly what I had built, what I had achieved, but because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about years of being silenced, dismissed, and ridiculed. It was about reclaiming every moment I had been told I wasn't enough. When the issue of Time magazine hit the stands, I bought 10 copies and tucked them neatly into a leather tote bag. On the cover, there I was, smiling confidently, arms crossed, with the headline, "The Woman Changing the Future of Technology." Every time I looked at it, a spark of satisfaction shot through me. But I didn't tell a soul in my family. Not my mom, not my brothers, not even little Lily. I wanted it to be organic, undeniable. I wanted the moment to come not from me flaunting it, but from someone else bringing it to light. On Christmas Eve, I drove up to Boston. The house looked the same as it always had, warm lights glowing in the windows, the smell of roasted ham wafting through the air, laughter spilling from inside. But as I stepped through the door, tote bag on my shoulder, I felt a quiet power humming inside me. My mom greeted me with her usual tight-lipped smile. "Emily. You made it." As though she had expected I might not. My brothers barely glanced up, too busy talking about their latest business ventures. I played along. I smiled, set my bag down, and joined them in the living room. It was all so predictable, the boasting, the subtle digs, the hierarchy of pride my mom always enforced. And then, like clockwork, came the moment that had haunted me since I was a teenager. My mom leaned back in her chair, glass of wine swirling in her hand, and said with a chuckle, "Emily, you'll never be as successful as your brothers. But that's all right. Not everyone can be." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply lifted my cup of tea and sipped, calm and silent. And right on cue, that's when Lily, sitting cross-legged on the rug flipping through a magazine, looked up and shouted the words that shattered the entire room. "Aunt Emily is on the cover of Time magazine." The second Lily's voice echoed through the room, everything stopped. You could have heard the clock ticking on the mantel. My mom froze, her glass of wine halfway to her lips. David set his phone down slowly, as if his brain couldn't quite process what his daughter had just said. Matthew leaned forward, brow furrowed. What did you just say, Lily? My mom asked, her tone sharp. Lily held up the magazine, her little face glowing with pride. Look. It's Aunt Emily. She's famous. She's on the cover. And there it was, me, smiling back at them from the glossy page. My photo, my name, the bold headline announcing to the world what I had accomplished. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. David blinked hard, like he was trying to convince himself it was some kind of joke. Matthew shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less confident than he had been a moment ago. And my mom's face went pale. She leaned forward, snatched the magazine from Lily's hands, and stared at the cover. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She flipped through the article quickly, her hands trembling just slightly. Finally, she looked up at me. This is you?" Her voice cracked, almost as though the reality was too heavy for her to carry. I just smiled, calm, collected. "Yes, Mom. That's me." David tried to recover first. "Well, I mean, anyone can get featured if they pay enough." But Lily interrupted, bless her heart. "No, Daddy. It says right here she's one of the most important businesswomen in America." She jabbed her finger at the paragraph where the journalist had written about my role in transforming Neurovision into a global powerhouse. Matthew stayed quiet, staring at me like he was meeting me for the first time. And then came my favorite moment, the one I had waited for all these years. My mom tried to form an excuse, some way to dismiss it, but the words wouldn't come. She had built her entire world on the belief that I was less than, and in that single instant, it crumbled. I leaned back in my chair, sipped my tea, and smiled. I didn't need to say anything. The silence of the room said it all. The silence didn't last forever, though I secretly wished it had. There was something delicious about watching them all sit there, their carefully constructed sense of superiority cracking in real time. But eventually, David broke it. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "that's impressive, Emily. I didn't know you were doing anything that big." His words were polite, but his tone carried a bitterness he couldn't quite hide. Matthew shifted in his seat. "Yeah, I mean, wow. So you've been keeping this from us?" I tilted my head slightly, savoring the moment. "I guess I just didn't think it was worth mentioning. You all seemed so busy talking about your achievements every year, I didn't want to interrupt." That one landed. I could see it in the way Matthew avoided my eyes and the way David's jaw tightened. My mom was the hardest to read. She sat there with the magazine in her lap, staring down at my picture like she couldn't reconcile the daughter she dismissed her whole life with the woman on the cover of Time. Finally, she muttered, "Why didn't you tell us?" I smiled faintly, the same calm smile I had given her when she'd said I'd never be as successful as my brothers. "Maybe I wanted you to see for yourself." That shut her down. The rest of the night was a strange dance. My brothers tried to steer the conversation back to themselves, but it didn't land the way it usually did. Every time they spoke, the unspoken weight of my achievement hovered in the room. Lily, meanwhile, wouldn't stop gushing about me, asking questions, reading snippets of the article aloud, even asking if she could bring the magazine to school. It was like the entire hierarchy of our family had flipped on its head, and no one quite knew how to handle it. I didn't brag. I didn't need to. I just sat there, sipping my tea, answering Lily's questions, and letting their discomfort wash over me like a reward years in the making. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the shadow in the room. I was the sun they couldn't ignore. The days after Christmas were almost surreal. Normally, I'd leave my mom's house feeling small, invisible, and exhausted from trying to survive the endless comparisons. But this time, I left with something different: silence. Not the kind that comes from being ignored, but the kind that follows shock. The next morning, at breakfast, my brothers were quieter than usual. David, who normally loved to command the room with stories about his law firm, barely spoke. He picked at his food, occasionally glancing at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't. Matthew was the same, distracted, withdrawn. My mom avoided my eyes altogether, her movements sharp and deliberate as she poured coffee or cleared plates. I didn't push it. I sat there calmly, buttering my toast, sipping my tea, and letting them stew. For years, I had endured their constant need to remind me where I stood in the family ranking. Now, I didn't need to say a single word. The shift in power had already happened. Later that afternoon, as I was packing up to leave, David pulled me aside. "Emily," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Listen. I didn't realize what you were doing with your career. It's impressive. I guess I underestimated you." The words were meant as a compliment, but I could hear the sting of pride behind them. I gave him a small nod. "Yes. You did." Matthew approached me too, though his approach was softer. "Hey, I read the article last night. It's really inspiring. You've done a lot. I'm proud of you." That one almost made me laugh. Proud of me? The same brother who spent my entire childhood making jokes about how I'd probably end up living in a studio apartment with a dozen cats? Still, I smiled politely and said, "Thanks, Matt. That means a lot." But the real victory came later, when my mom finally broke her silence. As I zipped up my coat, she came into the hallway and said, "Emily, I was hard on you growing up. Maybe too hard. I didn't think you had this in you." Her eyes softened for the first time I could remember. I was wrong. I let her words hang there for a moment before replying. "Yes, Mom. You were." And then I walked out the door, my tote bag slung over my shoulder, my copy of Time magazine tucked safely inside. That Christmas, I didn't just prove them wrong, I made them live in the silence of their own doubt. Driving back to New York after Christmas, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The silence. The looks on their faces. My mom's shaky voice admitting she had been wrong. For years, I'd dreamed about that moment. I used to lie awake at night as a teenager, wondering if I'd ever be able to stand tall in front of them, wondering if I'd ever escape being that afterthought. And now, it had happened. But the truth was, my revenge wasn't really about the cover of Time magazine. That was just the spark. My revenge had been building for decades, since the first time my mom told me David was the leader of the family, or when Matthew's science fair trophies lined the shelves while my drawings got shoved in a box. Every little dismissal had carved something into me. I realized something important as I drove: I didn't succeed despite them. I succeeded because of them. Their constant underestimation had hardened me, sharpened me, turned me into someone who could withstand long nights, constant doubt, and endless rejection. They had fueled the fire they thought would burn me out. Instead, it forged me. Back in New York, things only accelerated. Neurovision kept growing, and my name kept circulating in places my family could never reach. Conferences, keynote speeches, business panels, I was suddenly everywhere. Every time I stepped on stage, I thought about how, in my mom's living room, I was once told to let the boys talk. Now, the boys were listening to me. I didn't flaunt my success directly to my family, but I made sure they couldn't escape it either. Whenever a major article came out, I'd send a copy to Lily, because I knew she'd proudly show it off. When I was interviewed on TV, I'd let the clips circulate online, where I was sure David's and Matthew's colleagues would see it. Slowly, I was rewriting the narrative they'd built about me, not with words, but with undeniable proof. And the best part? I didn't need their approval anymore. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what they thought. But I did care about one thing: making sure they never forgot how wrong they were. The thing about success is that once you taste it, you realize it isn't just about the money or the titles, it's about influence. And influence, I learned, was the sharpest tool in my quiet revenge. My brothers had always loved parading their accomplishments in front of family friends, distant relatives, and anyone who would listen. David with his law firm partnerships, Matthew with his tech projects. Growing up, I'd been the silent audience to their endless boasting. But now, the dynamic was shifting, and I leaned into it. When Neurovision partnered with one of the biggest names in the medical field, the news made headlines. My face was plastered across industry articles, quoted as the visionary mind behind the branding that propelled the company into the mainstream. Not long after, I was invited to speak at Harvard Business School, the very place David used to brag about as though it were the pinnacle of human achievement. I accepted the invitation, gave a keynote in front of hundreds, and afterward, the dean sent me a personal letter of thanks. I made sure a copy of that letter was framed and hung in my office where my family couldn't miss it when they visited. Then came Matthew's downfall. His latest startup had been struggling quietly for months, though he hadn't told the family. One night, I got an email from a mutual acquaintance asking if Neurovision would consider acquiring it. I nearly laughed out loud. My brother, the one who used to mock me for playing with crayons, was now standing at the edge of having to sell his company to mine. I didn't gloat. I didn't even mention it when I saw him. But when our CEO turned down the acquisition, citing lack of long-term potential, I knew Matthew would hear those words. And I knew they would sting. At family gatherings, the shift became more obvious. People who once turned to David and Matthew for stories now turned to me. Cousins asked about my travels, uncles congratulated me on my speeches, and friends of the family whispered that they had seen me on TV. My brothers hated it, I could tell, but there was nothing they could do. I wasn't competing in their league anymore. I had built my own, and it was one they could never reach. For years, I had been the forgotten one at the table. Now, I was the centerpiece. And every time I caught my mom watching me with that quiet mix of pride and regret, I knew my revenge was working exactly as I'd planned. It was spring when the confrontation finally came. By then, months had passed since that unforgettable Christmas, and I had settled into a new rhythm, one where my name carried more weight than either of my brothers. Invitations, interviews, awards, it all became part of my daily life. But the funny thing about family dynamics is that they don't shift easily, even when the world outside sees you differently. My mom called one afternoon, her voice clipped and formal. "Emily, I think you should come up for dinner this weekend. We need to talk." Those 4 words, "we need to talk," were the same ones she had used my whole life before scolding me about my grades, my lack of direction, or my childish hobbies. I could hear the same tone, the same authority, even now. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was curious. When I arrived, the dinner felt tense from the start. My brothers were there too, sitting stiffly at the table. Mom served roast chicken, her usual, and for a while we made small talk. Then, she set her wine glass down and looked straight at me. "Emily," she said, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished. But don't you think you're getting a little carried away?" I raised an eyebrow. "Carried away? You're in magazines, on television, giving speeches. It's wonderful, of course. But in this family, we've always valued humility. I don't want you forgetting where you came from." That word, humility, nearly made me laugh. This from the woman who had paraded David and Matthew's accomplishments like trophies for decades. My brothers stared at their plates, clearly uncomfortable, but no one spoke. So I did. "Mom, with all due respect, you don't get to lecture me about humility. Not after everything you've said to me over the years. You told me I'd never measure up. You made me believe I was less. And now that I've proven you wrong, you want me to dim my light so you can feel comfortable again." Her lips tightened. "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant," I cut in. My voice was steady, calm, but it carried a weight I'd never dared use with her before. "You never believed in me. And that's fine, I didn't need you to. But don't think you get to take this away from me now." The room went silent again. David shifted in his chair, Matthew cleared his throat, but no one spoke. My mom looked at me, her eyes glistening, and for once, she had nothing to say. That night, I left her house knowing something had shifted permanently. I wasn't just successful in the world's eyes, I was finally free in hers. In the weeks after that dinner, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the fragile kind that comes from avoiding conflict, but the solid kind that comes from finally facing it head-on. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of my mom's words on my shoulders. I had stood my ground, and I had walked away unshaken. But there was one person in my family who had always been different, Lily. My niece, with her wild curiosity and boundless belief in me, had been the only one to see my worth long before anyone else did. She never looked at me like I was less than. She looked at me like I was something to aspire to. I thought back to that Christmas night when she shouted, "Aunt Emily is on the cover of Time magazine." The pride in her voice wasn't about what it meant for the family, or for her dad, or even for my mom. It was pure admiration, the kind I had craved as a child and never received. And in that moment, I knew what my next mission was, to make sure Lily never felt the way I had growing up. So, I started quietly weaving her into my world. When she mentioned she liked drawing, I sent her sketchbooks and colored pencils with little notes of encouragement. When she told me she wanted to learn coding, I arranged for her to sit in on a neurovision workshop for teens. I even set up a small college fund for her, separate from whatever my brother David might provide, so she would always have her own foundation to build on. I never told my family about these things. They didn't need to know. This wasn't about proving anything to them anymore, it was about creating something better for the one person who deserved it. And maybe, in a way, it was the purest form of revenge, breaking the cycle. While my mom had used comparison and criticism to pit us against each other, I was going to use my success to lift Lily up. Because the best way to prove them all wrong wasn't just by thriving, it was by ensuring the next generation never had to fight the same battles I did. It didn't take long before everyone started noticing the change in Lily. At first, it was small things. She'd show up at family dinners carrying one of the sketchbooks I'd given her, doodling quietly at the table the way I used to. Only instead of being dismissed the way I had been, she had me there, nodding in approval, asking her about her ideas, encouraging her to keep going. Then it grew bigger. One afternoon, David pulled me aside after a family gathering. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Emily, Lily won't stop talking about you. She's obsessed. Every time I ask her what she wants to do when she grows up, she says, 'I want to be like Aunt Emily.'" He tried to laugh it off, but I could tell it unsettled him. For years, he had been the model of success in her eyes, the one she was supposed to emulate. But now, the balance had shifted. His own daughter was measuring ambition by my example, not his. I shrugged, keeping my voice light. "She's just curious. Kids latch onto role models sometimes. That's a good thing, right?" But inside, I felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about turning Lily against him, it was about showing her a different path, one where she didn't have to chase approval or squeeze into the mold her father and grandmother wanted for her. Over time, Lily grew bolder. She started asking me questions no one else in the family ever asked. "How did you know what you wanted to do? What did you do when people didn't believe in you? How do you stay strong when people say mean things?" I gave her the answers I wish someone had given me at her age. I told her it was okay to not know exactly what she wanted yet. That it was okay to be underestimated, that sometimes it was the best fuel. And most importantly, that her worth wasn't defined by her dad's approval, her grandma's standards, or anyone else's opinion. Watching her soak up those words, I realized my revenge had transformed into something deeper. I wasn't just proving my family wrong anymore, I was reshaping what success and strength looked like for the next generation. And nothing could scare them more than that. The cracks started to show the following Thanksgiving. Normally, those dinners had been David's stage. He'd go on and on about his firm's high-profile clients, while Matthew chimed in with updates about his latest projects. Mom would nod approvingly, raising her glass as if she had molded them herself. But this year, the spotlight shifted. Lily burst through the door carrying a folder of drawings she'd been working on. The first thing she did was run straight to me. "Aunt Emily. Look, I made these designs for a video game idea I have." She spread them out across the table, colorful sketches of characters and worlds that looked more imaginative than anything I had drawn at her age. The entire family gathered around to see, but instead of brushing her off, they looked to me for a reaction. "Wow," I said, kneeling beside her. "These are incredible, Lily. You know, with work like this, you could design for a real studio someday, or even start your own." Her eyes lit up like fireworks. "Really?" "Really," I said, squeezing her hand. David shifted uncomfortably in the background. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "that's nice. But she should probably focus on school first. Practical things. You know, realistic goals." Lily shot him a look that startled me. It was the same look I used to give my mom when I was younger, except Lily had something I didn't at her age, someone in her corner. "Dad," she said firmly, "Aunt Emily says I can do it. And she's on Time magazine." The room went dead quiet for a moment. My brothers both looked like they'd swallowed something sour, and my mom pressed her lips together so tightly they nearly disappeared. I stayed quiet, letting Lily's words hang in the air. That was the beauty of it. I didn't have to gloat. I didn't have to argue. My success had already shifted the gravity of the room, and my niece was the proof. Later, as the night wound down, I caught Matthew watching me with a strange expression. Not anger, not resentment, something closer to fear. As if he realized, maybe for the first time, that the old hierarchy was gone. For so long, they had defined me as the least. Now, without lifting a finger, I had become the most. And the irony? It wasn't even about me anymore. It was about the little girl who had chosen me as her role model, and the family who couldn't stop her from doing it. The opportunity came almost by accident. A national business conference invited me to give the keynote address. It was a huge event, hundreds of executives, investors, and leaders from across the country. My face was on posters, my name printed in bold on the program. At first, I planned to keep it professional, to talk about neurovision, branding, and innovation. But then I thought of Christmas, of all the years I'd sat silently while my family tore me down. And I realized this was it, my moment to close the book on that chapter of my life, publicly, in a way they could never ignore. So, I invited them. Every single one of them. My mom, my brothers, even Lily. I didn't frame it as revenge, of course, I just said, "It might be nice for you to see what I've been working on." They accepted, probably out of curiosity more than anything. The night of the keynote, I walked on stage to a standing ovation. I spotted them in the crowd, Mom sitting stiffly, David with his arms crossed, Matthew pretending to take notes. Lily, though, looked like she was about to burst with excitement. I began my speech the usual way, talking about resilience, creativity, and the importance of believing in yourself when no one else does. And then I paused. "I want to tell you a story," I said, my eyes scanning the audience until they landed on the familiar faces in the crowd. When I was younger, I was told, over and over again, that I'd never measure up. That my brothers were destined for greatness, and I was destined to drift. That my dreams were just hobbies. That success wasn't for me. The room went quiet. I could almost feel my family squirming in their seats. But here's the truth, sometimes the greatest gift you can be given is doubt. Because when people doubt you, you learn to prove them wrong. And when you prove them wrong, you don't just succeed. You soar. Applause erupted. Cameras flashed. I smiled, not at the crowd, but at Lily, who was clapping harder than anyone. In that moment, I knew my revenge was complete. Not the petty kind, not the cruel kind, but the kind that left no room for denial. My family couldn't diminish me anymore. My story had been rewritten, not in their living room, but on a stage the world was watching. And the best part? I didn't even need their applause. I already had my own. The weeks after the keynote felt like a closing chapter. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying old wounds. I wasn't replaying my mother's words in my head or comparing myself to my brothers. I was free. The conference had been covered by the press, and my speech went viral online. My inbox flooded with messages from strangers, people who had been told they weren't enough, thanking me for giving them hope. That meant more to me than any award or title ever could. But the real ending came quietly. A month later, Lily mailed me a letter. Inside was a drawing, me on stage, smiling, with the words, "She proved them wrong," written in her neat little handwriting. Beneath it, she'd written, "When I grow up, I don't want to be like Dad. I don't want to be like Uncle Matt. I want to be like you. Thank you for showing me it's okay to dream big." I sat at my desk, holding that letter, tears welling in my eyes. It hit me then, the revenge was never really about my mom or my brothers. It was about breaking the chains they had tried to wrap around me, and making sure Lily never had to wear them. The next family Christmas was different. My brothers still bragged, my mom still tried to steer conversations, but it didn't touch me anymore. I didn't need their approval, their recognition, or even their apology. I had already won. Not because I was on magazine covers. Not because I had outshone them. But because I had turned their doubt into fuel, their silence into power, and their dismissal into my drive. And as I watched Lily show everyone her latest project, an app she was designing with her friends, I realized something even sweeter: my success wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of hers. That night, as I sipped my tea by the fireplace, I caught my mom staring at me again. But this time, her eyes weren't cold. They were resigned. Maybe even a little proud. I just smiled. Because after everything, I had the one ending they could never take away from me: peace, power, and a future that was finally mine.